Hello, everyone. Andy here from Biohazard Declassified. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Biohazard Declassified podcast. We've got some very special guests in the house today. We have Steamforged Games, who are going to speak about their fantastic board game series, Resident Evil, the board game. So, introduce yourself, guys.
Do you want to go first, Si?
Sure. Yes, my name's Si White. I am a developer on Resident Evil board game. And outside of that, you might know me on the Resident Evil social media sphere for First Aid Spray, which I'm the host and CEO of. And I also run the whirlwind success that I didn't expect Twitter account, ResiFacts, as well.
Cool. My name is Sherwin Matthews. I'm lead designer for Steamforged Games. I was lead designer for Resident Evil 3, Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil, also Horizon Zero Dawn. What else? Bardsung. Design credits for Monster Hunter, Gears of War, a lot of our games, basically.
Glorious. A well-esteemed, time-served man, no doubt.
I said old guard, but yeah,
I'll take the mixture of the two, old man, and we'll go from there. That's how it feels most days.
Okay, so if we could kind of rewind, Resident Evil, the board game, where did the idea for this originally spawn?
So this is going way, way, way back now. So our chief creative, Matt Hart, our boss, and also co-founder of Steamforged, actually used to work for Capcom way back when, and had a whole bunch of different game contacts in the world before he went into board games and stuff. And basically it's something where at some point after we'd made Dark Souls, the board game, which did pretty well, as most people remember, on Kickstarter, we started talking to other companies about different games and bits and pieces we could do. And then Matt came up with Resident Evil shortly thereafter. Now, my involvement wasn't necessarily in the initial conversation about what properties and what licenses to run with us straight away. I came in shortly thereafter where Matt sort of sat down with me one afternoon and said, "Do you know what, Sherwin? We're going to make a new game. I want you to be lead design. And I think the key thing that I want you to do is I think it's really the sort of game that you're going to enjoy." And I'm like, "Okay, that sounds cool. What is it?" And he went, "It's going to be Resident Evil." And at that point, I think I might have literally leapt out of my chair with excitement in terms of getting to make this product. And then we had a really, really awesome drive up to what we internally call a design week, which is where all of our design team, for the most part, go away. Or back then, certainly anyway, it was a bit smaller. Used to basically we would get a sort of a lodge effectively out in the middle of nowhere, and then really deep dive into game design stuff for like a solid week of backwards and forwards of prototypes and whiskey and all sorts of various different things flying around in sort of this raw creative space. And that kind of really is where Resident Evil 2, as it were, the first one we did, really spawned out of. And ever since then, obviously, we kept on running. Resident Evil 2 happened, was a Kickstarter, was definitely a very big success, was awesome, spawned an amazing community around the game, which is really, really cool. And, from there, we made Resident Evil 3, and then most recently, Resident Evil.
Of course. And is it still up on Kickstarter, or is it?
So Resident Evil 3, obviously Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 are now released in the wild. Resident Evil Kickstarter has finished, but you can still late pledge it now, and I would definitely recommend doing that because the pledge is incredible value, considering what it would cost you at retail to get it. So you can find that on GameFound. Also, if you head over to the Steamforged socials, you won't be far. The Steamforged website, you should be able to find it, and I imagine our socials will probably be pointing at it as well.
Why did you start with Resident Evil 2, out of curiosity?
So at the time, we talked to Capcom, and it was like, which one of these Resident Evil games? And obviously, the first thing you would go to is, well, let's make the first game, right? So let's make Resident Evil 0. No, let's make Resident Evil. And you kind of zoom in on that one. And Capcom said, yeah, but, there's a remake of Resident Evil 2 coming. because at this point they'd already announced it. And you guys are Resident Evil guys. You'll remember that Capcom announced Resident Evil 2, and then there wasn't really any word whatsoever for the longest time. And it was right in the middle of that bit, and they kind of said, you're going to get some flack when you announce this, because we haven't done anything with it since saying Resident Evil 2 is being remade. So just as a heads up, but we do think this is the right thing, because looking at the release window when you're talking about doing your Kickstarter and the actual product is coming out is around the time that Resident Evil 2 remake is going to land. And that's exactly why we did it. So we kind of did Resident Evil 2 then, and a similar story for why we did Resident Evil 3 versus Resident Evil then. And it just so happened that this last year just been obviously was the 25th anniversary, so that worked really, really well for doing Resident Evil.
I suppose it's kind of snowballed in a way. You took the idea of Resident Evil 2, the board game, then it was RE3 and then RE1. It's unique to have a board game that has sequels.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. When we were doing Resident Evil 2, there were a whole bunch of people in the comments who sort of said, we really like Resident Evil. This is awesome. Can we see Jill? Can we see Chris? Can we see Barry? It'd be awesome if we could see some of the rest of the Stars team, that sort of stuff. And whenever we make a Resident Evil game, we always work very closely with Capcom. Love working with those guys, and we always have a very narrow parameter of we can do quite a lot within the context of what the original IP game is, but we don't really want to step outside of that. Mostly because it keeps the game quite concise, keeps it quite focused, and it means you don't spill out into this homogenization of kind of where every game's got Jill in it, for example, or every game's got Leon in it, because that would be the worst thing ever. And basically we kind of zoom in on that stuff. Now, in terms of what I think happens with a lot of games of this sort of stuff is people kind of generally go, oh, this is Resident Evil, the board game. And then they would just chuck everything from all of the games into it as much as they possibly could. Whereas we really want to focus in on this is the experience of this particular game, because these are big games that are much beloved by fans. It wouldn't do them a good service if you kind of mash them all into one big Omni game.
Yeah, so I just wanted to jump in there as well. What Sharon sort of touched on briefly was sort of just how wonderful that community that grew out of Resident Evil 2, the board game was, which is how Sherwin and I met. And for everyone that was part of that community, including Sherwin and some Steamforged guys that were Resident Evil fans, I'm sure that was wonderful. Just see lots of Resident Evil love in general, the board game specifically, but also just people just talking about Resident Evil. And I think Capcom in general are very receptive to listening to what people want. And it was very clear immediately that there was this hungry audience based off of the board game that going, we want to see these characters, these games. And there was constantly like polls of what you'd like to see in the board game, what game, you still get them now, what game would they like to see adapted into a board game next? So I think it really was, with the success of Resident Evil 2, the board game, it was just like, okay, where do we go next? Because there was going to be something, right? Because there was an established audience that just wanted more.
Yeah, just to jump in on that, and I see a few of them in the comments here. Big shout out to Sharky especially. I love that guy. We've got there's so much character and so much devotion. It really is one of the best board game communities I've ever been a part of, and I don't say that lightly. As I've already said, I've been involved in lots of our different projects and lots of our different stuff. But Resident Evil as a game series not only has a special place in my heart, but the community have been so welcoming and so just amazing at just spreading the good word, at getting involved, at kind of constantly finding ways to reinvent kind of the game or have fun, whether that be kind of, here's my campaign, everyone, this is what's happening, or I'm really excited, or here's me painting my models for the first time, or, just reaching out and sort of, getting as many people involved as they can, because they just love our games. They love Resident Evil. It's just really, really humbling to see that and to see a part of that, basically. So
in its, I'm going to try and say in summary, but and do your best to do this. But in summary, how does it, for people that don't typically play board games, how does the board game work, and how does it differ to the original source material?
So when we start making any game, I'm going to give you a roundabout politician's answer to this one. So when we start making a game, one of the biggest things we want to always avoid is we never want to call what we internally call white box, although that's not necessarily an industry term. We never want to white box something. We never want to take a game and then just go, here's a skin, that'll fine. Just slap, here's an engine, just slap a skin on top of that, and that'll do. Like, we don't want, that's not really us. What we want to drill into is we like to make our games feel like they are literally like playing the original source material if it's a licensed product. So for Resident Evil, it's a case of how do we identify what the what is it? What do people who play Resident Evil the video game? What do they really love about the game? What makes it characteristic to them? How do they know they're playing a Resident Evil game? And we kind of drill into that. So that was really, well, what is survival horror? If you have to drill into survival horror and work out what it is, how do you quantify that? And the first one is, well, it's all about tension. It's about being afraid, not necessarily of like every immediate jump scare. It's that sort of creeping tension element to it, that sort of creeping suspense element to it. It's not a game where you're just throwing ammunition at zombies and just gunning them down by throwing dice at the problem. It is something where you need to, count every bullet. You need to think, very much resources, kind of, can I afford to go through that corridor because I'm pretty dinged up and I've got barely any ammo? Can I creep around a different way? Or do I need to risk it because the other way is just as dangerous? I don't want to go into that room, whatever else. Various different focuses around that. It's also, what are the type of objectives that you have when you play this game and so on. And there's lots of different capacities, there's lots of different components and lots of different parts that we look at to kind of mesh together. Now, obviously, some of that you can't translate on a one-to-one basis. As much as our early attempts, and we had this at one of our first design weeks, we kind of had a joke where someone said the best way to deploy a licker is to just literally start screaming and then drop it in the middle of the table. Like, that's not practical. And even after lots of whiskey, that's not practical because you miss the table. But the point is that it's something where we kind of look to emulate that in different ways. So how do we make it so that you really are afraid? Well, how about we tell you that you've got a deck of cards that you draw from at the end of every turn. The liquor is in there somewhere. You don't know when it's going to drop out and attack you. Suddenly you've got that same level of fear that, okay, something's out there. I don't know what it is. And then you could do lots of mechanics, like you might hear kind of, sort of a hissing sound. So basically you search the deck for the liquor card and then you shuffle it into the top half. So now it's getting closer. Or you might kind of, how do we emulate this idea of you've only got so many bullets? Well, we have a dial that counts down. So every single time you use a bullet, you've got a very visceral reminder of my bullets are getting low. And I'm actually picking up the dial and moving things around in a very tactile way to really count that down. Little sort of psychological tricks that we can do really lean into what that is. And I think what we get a lot of feedback from is people say, well, actually, you've really authentically recreated that experience on the tabletop as a result. Playing Resident Evil, the game, or the board game, feels just like playing the video game because you're tapping into the same thing. I am afraid to go through that room. I am afraid of what's going to jump out and grab me. I am counting every bullet. I am running around. I am counting my resources. Healing is a scary thing. As in I can heal, but then where does the next first aid spray or green herb come from or whatever? This is the kind of stuff we want to zoom into. And one of my most favorite things that anyone told me was, your remake of Resident Evil 3 is more authentic than the remake of Resident Evil 3. And at that point, I'm like, do you know what? Then we've done exactly what we tried to set out to do.
It is an interesting medium to adapt a game to. We've seen film adaptations, we've seen series adaptations, but a board game adaptation, what challenges would you say you've faced adapting it to board, if you could name a few?
I'm very conscious I'm talking a whole bunch. So, Si, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah,
this also gives me a bit of time to think about it as well.
I've got no answers to that question. I would echo everything Joe said previously about how playing the board game, because I was one of those people in the community before I worked for Steamforged. In fact, the Resident Evil 2 the board game, Joe and I have talked about this before, was really it wasn't my entry into tabletop, but it was certainly the thing that really kicked the door wide open as sort of a new hobby for me. And part of that was like just how easy it was to pick up and play for someone who knew the video game and was like, oh, I understand all of this. The way that it works makes sense to me because it's reflecting a game that I've played dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of times. Whereas like everything I love about that game is in this version. It's like I get to play my favorite game in a brand new way. And more than that, just like a tiny thing for like the Resident Evil diehards out there is you can't get that first experience for Resident Evil 2 back once you've done it. All you can do is play it faster, harder, just destroy the game with your might. You can't get all that, tension and fear back. But the board game kind of enforces that a lot more. Like you retain that tension because of the sort of, as Sharon was saying, the not knowing, rather than it being a video game where it's like, I know where all the enemies are going to be and stuff like that. The board game has got a lot more unexpectedness to it, I think.
Yeah,
like a randomizer almost, maybe.
To a certain extent.
Yeah, I was about to jump in on there. Let me do that. And this isn't answering your question, but I promise I will get back to that.
I appreciate that.
So one of the things. So Resident Evil's a really interesting game series. The first time you play through a Resident Evil game is fundamentally different to every other time you play through the same game. So the first time you play through it, you are scared. You are worried about what's around the next corner. You are exploring, kind of, really trying to survive. The moment you complete that game, every subsequent playthrough, you are basically, as Sai says, you're burning through it with all of your might, trying to beat your score, trying to get the better ranking, and trying to finish it as quickly as you humanly can. And that's a very different experience because suddenly, your jump scare is a jump scare, so you might jump still whenever that licker smashes through the observation room or whatever else, right? But that's simply biological. Your experience is more so much something where I know where everything is, so I can chart out exactly my route of where I'm going to go from A to B to C to D and so on. The board game, every location of every item is randomized. So seldom will you find those handgun bullets in the same place each time. Sometimes it might be a green herb, sometimes it's first aid spray, sometimes it's bullets, and so on. And when we get into the Resident Evil 3, the cutscenes are randomized. So we have narrative events which are effectively cutscenes. You may well meet Brad in Bar Jack and then him sort of tell you, oh, watch out for Nemesis come. But sometimes you play it, that's actually going to be Marvin, or that might be Murphy or somebody else. It's not always Brad who gets killed outside of the police building, the RPD building. You might not meet Marvin Branner sort of bleeding out in the office. It actually might be kind of Brad Vickers. The whole game of where different events happen switches around. You may even not meet any of those people in the police RPD building. That may just not be a thing that happens. And the way that your characters, where they do their heroic last stands or don't do that at all, may also switch around. RE3 especially is really good for what that kind of emergent storytelling is, because the order in which you explore is entirely open to you. It's an open world board game. You can wander around and do the scenarios in any order you want. You can go, do you know what? I'm not even going to go downtown at first. I'm going to explore all of Uptown first, because we can go through those different areas, find where the tram is, beat the gravedigger. Now we're going to go back and check out downtown, or then go into the commercial districts or whatever else, or you can balance those out. There's lots of stuff that the game does that really reinvents the lore for diehard fans, where they can have a lot of fun with it and kind of really re-experience that. And every time you play it, it's completely different. It will never be the same 2 times through, which, exactly as Sai says, really taps into that idea that you want to really look at this and go, this is cool. I get that first experience every single time. There's multiple ways to complete scenarios. There's multiple objectives. There's multiple events that happen during them, like the events of how enemies turn up and so on will change. Really, really good.
Plus, on top of that, multiple characters to play as well.
Also true, yeah.
Outfitted in different ways with different abilities and stuff like that to change up that playstyle.
Which ties into what I was going to say. So some of the more challenging things to try and bring to the tabletop, the honest answer is trying to bring the characters to life is probably one of the more challenging things, because obviously some of these characters, you could play as Dario, for example, in Resident Evil 3. In Resident Evil 2, you can play as Ben Bertolucci. Like, there's lots of... And trying to drill into those characters and make it feel like you are playing as that particular character moving around is really interesting, because obviously we have a limited, narrow parameter of stats that we can work with and special abilities that we can bounce off of, and we want to kind of tell a story of how they work. And I'm now going to drop some spoilers about Resident Evil, which people don't know, if you don't mind, because one of the things that we managed to achieve, having recently been playtesting and signing off on Resident Evil 1's characters, I'm super, super, super happy with Joseph Frost. So Joseph starts off as this character he's really fast. So this won't necessarily mean anything to people who haven't played the game, but I'm going to assume there's a few people in the audience who have. So so the first thing you can do before you do anything is basically you can jump ahead a square. You can place into an adjacent square. This immediately makes him 1 square faster than everybody else if you're just sprinting around. When you open a door and go to a new room, you can jump ahead another square. So you can really place yourself all over the place. His evade skills are absolutely garbage. And what we've effectively done is this character is really reckless and is running around everywhere and his speed to explore. Now, in Resident Evil, we also have these things called advanced characters. Advanced characters are basically the character a bit further on after they've survived some great traumatic experience, or they've leveled up effectively. In Joseph's case, I've survived being attacked by dogs. I'm literally being ripped and being mauled to death. So advanced Joseph, actually, well, when he goes to a corpse, and if the corpse stands up or anything bad happens, he can teleport away from the corpse because he's scared of corpses now. So he can really dive out of the way. And the other thing is when he goes into a dangerous room, he can just get right the back out of there, away from anything that happens. He's super, super cautious. Suddenly his evade skills are through the roof, but now he's timid and won't necessarily go and do lots of different stuff for you. So at that point, we've really kind of evolved how you can expect that character to play over the sort of narrative of what it is, but we've also used it to inform the character and make it feel just like Joseph that you've seen.
What's been for you, Sherwin, the most rewarding experience adapting these games to board game format?
I don't know about the most rewarding, but certainly the most humbling part is being able to interact with so many hardcore Resident Evil fans and have them tell me how much they love the games that we make. That by far and away outweighs so much more. There are an awful lot of late nights and weekends and long calls, meetings and all sorts of stuff with making any game. And there's a lot of crunch, and there's an awful lot of pushing having lumps of cardboard in your living room or in your office or whatever else with like squares drawn on them, and using around like old models you have from another game or whatever, and rolling dice and tokens that don't match up to anything. I think if people saw what board game development is like, they'd be shocked by just how kind of it feels almost like your rules are in on the back of a fag packet, and you're kind of really just going through doing as much as you can with this thing, but it really does look very, very basic. And then one of the most exciting parts is obviously and also nerve-wracking is when it comes to life and suddenly there's proper graphics to go with it, and it's had artwork attached to it, and now it's a rule book, and now it's living and breathing, and it feels like that. And it's scary because obviously you hope that, well, hopefully all that mess that I had in my living room or my desk or whatever now works out okay. But I think it's got to be that when that actually lands with people and people start unwrapping it and you see how excited they are and how enthusiastic they are, and seeing people say some of the absolutely lovely things they've always said about our games, it really is very humbling, and it's amazing to be part of that, to suddenly just have this outpouring of just positivity. And I think that's probably one of the greatest things that I've enjoyed out of making Resident Evil games.
And Si, for you, I appreciate that you've not been with Steamforged Games for as long as Sherwin has, but of the time that you've been with Steamforged, what's been your most rewarding experience?
I mean, immediately the first thing that comes to mind is just sort of like the unique journey that I've got to experience coming in as a fan of Resident Evil 2 and now working on Resident Evil board game. I sort of came in at the development stage where we were sort of doing a lot of internal playtesting. In my case, I didn't have to use badly drawn maps and random tokens because pre-existing Resident Evil board games existed, so I just proxied those in. But getting to play Resident Evil the board game early, and then sitting in a meeting and kind of giving my opinion on certain things and those things being tweaked is amazing, considering a few years ago, as I said, I wasn't really a tabletop gamer. I was just getting into it through Resident Evil 2, the board game, and it's accelerated so fast to the point where it's like, Joe and I and our colleague Steve are sitting in a call talking about how we can make Neptune more threatening, stuff like that.
You guys totally should have listened to my ideas.
We'll have that conversation, then I'll sit down in front of it and be like, immediately go, no, this can't rewrite, and we have to have another call. That's so amazing to be able to actually contribute to something like that. That, as Sherwin just said, I was one of those enthusiastic fans, and now I'm kind of my name's in the
Living
rule
the dream.
book. Yeah, and it's official. So I appreciate it's a very unique perspective, but yeah, it's still kind of a whirlwind, to be honest.
It's a very we get to do a very surreal and wonderful thing, but very seldom does it feel like work. It always feels
Brilliant.
fun. Like I've had calls that like start 8:30 in the morning, for an early start for whatever reason, where we spend an hour talking about goblins. Obviously not in relation to Resident Evil, but that feels like a very surreal work day when that happens.
Yeah.
So
So, for people who aren't familiar with board game development, if you could cast your attention back to RE2 from initial conception to final print and it's out into consumers' hands, what was the time scale of that?
I think generally most RE games are about 18-month development. 18-month developments, of which, I mean, it's difficult to break down. A lot of that is manufacturing and shipping. People don't realize just how long it actually takes to physically make a game. But in terms of design, I mean, Resident Evil 2 had a little bit more ahead of it than Resident Evil 3 and Resident Evil, purely because Resident Evil 2 built the survival horror engine that all of our current Resident Evil games operate on. So the system, which is action, reaction, and then tension phases. So that took a little bit more development just to make sure that really worked. Obviously, when we looked at Resident Evil 3, our approach was very much similar to how Capcom approached the original Resident Evil games, which is we have our core engine, our tank controls, and this is how it operates. And what we now want to do is polish that and kind of add other components around it to kind of make that a little bit more of a heightened experience or a bit better or whatever else. And at the same time, change the world around it to better reflect what Raccoon City or the RPD building or whatever else. Add in new enemies. So I'd say RE2 was probably, in the grand scheme of things, probably more like a 2-year development. The other two have both been 18 months.
And there was an expansion pack as well, wasn't there? For RE2 had the expansion pack.
There's an awful lot of expansions in all of these. One of the things that goes hand in hand with Kickstarter. So that's actually one of the things. Another challenge potentially is approaching an RE game or any game when you're bringing it out to Kickstarter. You have to think about what's the best way to really package this thing, or what's the best way to present it going forward, where you can then start to release, where you can release it as a concise experience for someone. But obviously, by nature of what Kickstarter is, you need to have expansions to sort of add into that, so that way people who are super invested in it can kind of heighten their experience or get extra campaign bits and pieces bolted in. Now, RE2 had probably a few too many in retrospect. Purely because it was something where it's a surprisingly large game when you look at RE2, and it's also something where we were still quite new to what how we approach Kickstarter and so on then, and the model was very much sort of the one set up by some of our some other companies, where they kind of had just lots of boxes of plastic with lots of enemies in them and lots of other bits and pieces. And we weren't sure of ourselves, but knew that the Kickstarter community kind of expected that and was built around that model. So we followed that one. Since then, what we've done is we've listened to a lot of feedback from people saying, well, it would be good if there was more condensed in. We've tried to make Resident Evil games feel more like there's less expansions to go with it, feel more concise. We've polished on that. And also we've started to establish our own idea of what a Kickstarter campaign could be. Probably with the most exciting one being the Resident Evil one we just did, which I think we did really, really interestingly, where we actually offered everybody an open world campaign. So backers who joined up in the Resident Evil, we had a piece of narrative that followed the journey through the mansion and then through the caves and all the other areas around the mansion as we went. And every single day, player or backers got to vote on what direction they wanted to go to next. And depending on where they went to, they would unlock certain things and add them to their pledge. So they might hear some screams coming from one room. They go in, oh, wow, we've just found forest, for example, or, we've just done this or that or whatever. And there was a really interesting thing where when there are moments of danger, players were voting on who's going to try and make it out of the mansion. Whoever doesn't actually gets killed and doesn't get to survive the defensive mansion, which is kind of interesting. And we had some interesting things there. No one expected Kenneth to be one of the first people that everyone saved. which was kind of interesting. And it was really interesting watching the politics going on in the back of comments where people were kind of going, hey, vote for Barry. You know, Barry's our guy, for example. And of course, they're right. Alternatively, we had other people kind of arguing about, no, we need to try and get Forrest or whatever. We had some real interesting heroes come out of that experience, which is really fun. And I think by now the expansions have sort of found their way into quite a nice place where they all feel like they've got their own reasons going in there rather than just being this sort of box of stuff for people to buy, and also have their own theme and their own character and bring their own components to what the game should be, which is fun.
I just wanted to sort of add on to that as well when you talk about expansions and sort of the reduced number. I don't think in any way that means that there's any more missing kind of elements. So part of the Resident Evil 2 board game campaign, the people there will very much remember this, but there was a lot of talk when we were revealing what's in the game for like, oh, this isn't in yet, let's talk about this. And pretty much everything from Resident Evil 2 is in that game. I can't think of a single element that's not in the board game in some fashion in terms of characters and locations and enemies. There was a huge campaign to get the moth in there, which wasn't originally planned for, that became like this strange cult of hashtag praise the moth, which has kind of really set up a lot of what the community sort of took moving forward. So Resident Evil 3, a similar thing where I don't think you could think of many, if any, things from the original Resident Evil 3 that aren't in Resident Evil 3, the board game. And there are a couple things that perhaps necessarily weren't being considered, as far as I know, because I wasn't at the company at that point. But everybody really wanted a helicopter in some form. So the helicopter cutscene is in there that got added because people were just crazy for it. And again, with Resident Evil, the board game, there's been elements that people were very vocal about making sure was in there. And once again, I don't think we've missed anything from Resident Evil, the remake at least, with a couple of little extras thrown in there as well. So these are, despite maybe having less number of expansions, the scope of content is still everything that you'd expect from that video game in board game form.
Yeah, so definitely.
Go on. Go on.
I was going to say, so we've also seen the opportunity to bring back some other stuff, which is kind of fun. So again, another spoiler for everybody, but in Resident Evil, the board game, during one of the bits, you can actually go up into the observatory bit from the original OG Resident Evil during one of the scenarios. So the elevator, which brings you up from the basement into the to near where the kitchen is, can actually stop and keep going up there to the bit where you used to be able to look out over the old helipad and stuff. Because we wanted to be there. There's always nods and there's always sort of small references to bits and pieces here and there in every one of our Resident Evil games. As Sai kind of alluded to earlier, so many of us are huge Resident Evil fans, and we always want to put in as much as we possibly can. So,
I'd like to direct this question to you, Sai. Imagine there was, like, you had a friend. Imagine you had a friend. No.
That's the whole
amazing. Yeah. Just imagine for a moment you're
it,
popular and have friends.
Think about it every night before I go to sleep. You know.
Imagine you had a friend and you really wanted to get them involved into playing tabletop board games, but specifically Resident Evil. What would be your elevator pitch to kind of get them on board?
I think we've already pretty much hit the nail in that it's, if you love these Resident Evil games, then there is, I think, surety that you're going to love the board games, because they're not just faithful, but also if I was allowed for like an extended elevator pitch of say 30 minutes, I can get you through the first scenario of Resident Evil 2, the board game, which introduces some of the core mechanics without going crazy over the top. If you're not a board game player, it just sort of gives you the basics of how to play the game. It takes you from the crash site, obviously the very beginning in the city streets, to the front of the RPD. You've got a taste for the vast majority of it, and you've seen how faithful it is. At that point, I think any Resident Evil video game player will be in at that point. Honestly, and that's the way that we do all of these board games, is we kind of treat them as if they're a video game. They are sort of set up to be sort of tutorialized. You're not throwing everything at once. You're not expected to memorize all of these rules. It's like, let's introduce you to this point, and now we're going to slowly start injecting that flavor and the sort of fear factor that comes with all of that as well. So really honestly, just sitting someone down who was curious about it with the first scenario of any one of the games, really, I think that would speak for itself. That's how confident I am in them.
Yeah, if I can, I appreciate the question was for Sire, but if I can bolt into there a little bit, one of the things which I was acutely aware of beginning work on RE2 was that, excuse me, that a lot of our audience would not be board gamers by nature. A lot of our gamers would be video gamers who just love Resident Evil. And Sai, you're a really good example of this.
Sure.
And it's something where we wanted to make something which I could teach you in 5 minutes or less. If we sit down to play it, it's not super complex. It's not something you need to read pages and pages of stuff before you understand something. We originally had a DM, a dungeon master character, who would sort of control the enemies and so on, and very quickly went, do you know, whilst that might work if you're an RPG guy, like if you're someone who doesn't necessarily play that sort of stuff, what it really amounts to is that someone sitting around that table has to lose, and you also eliminate kind of the solo player. So at that point, not really the right way to go. So let's automate what that does. Let's try and find a way of doing a card deck to do the decisions that would be. And I think that's a crucial point to it. The amount I've gone to like a whole bunch of different cons and a whole bunch of different shows and so on, and basically demoed RE, and whether that be RE2, RE3, and hopefully RE going forward. And every single time I sit down and you kind of see people play it for like, I don't know, it's very rare that I have to talk someone through the game loop, as in their turn, more than once. Normally, it's a case of, hey, let's sit down, right? So you could do this and this and this. You blast through, and by the end of that loop, you already see people thinking, going, cool. So my next turn, I'm going to do this and this, and that's going to be cool. And I do this. But the other part that's really cool is you kind of see people playing it for like a couple of turns, and then there's this magical moment where their head clicks, and they're like, I'm not actually trying to kill these zombies. I'm trying to shoot them out the way so I can weave my way past them and dodge past, just like the video game. I'm trying to save ammo. Like I've seen people who play the game and start off and they go, I'm just trying to kill everything in the room, and I just keep shooting at this thing and it's not dying. I'm like, well, how have you played Resident Evil? Yeah. How many bullets did it take to kill a zombie? I don't know, probably about 8 or 9. So how many bullets have you shot at the zombie so far? Well, no, about 6. Well, you've got another 3 to go then, haven't you? And it's like, it's that sort of stuff. Like, people are so used to that board game space being something which replicates a board game kind of way of doing things, or they're just not sure what they're doing. But the best thing I always find is to hone in on that core experience and just try to remember the audience and try to remember what it is that makes them tick.
And that is true, as I just said, of all the Resident Evil games. But I think the vast majority of Steamforged games, at least that I've played or have worked on, are set up, especially with the ones that are based on, we've done a lot of adaptations of video games, and we always keep in mind that a lot of that player base might not have that much or much at all board game experience. So they're all pretty much set up to be welcoming to new players in that way, where we're not going to bombard them. We're just going to introduce you to what's fun about that gameplay loop, and then from there you're just going to be able to bolt more on top of that as you play.
So Resident Evil, the board game, your latest project, where are you, if you can, of course, where are you at currently, and what's kind of the timeline moving forward?
For Resident Evil, sorry.
Yes.
So Resident Evil, so really interesting at this point. It's literally running through things as we speak now. So I've just finished the last of my sort of sanity check playtesting. I'm not going to take the credit for playtesting the game and so much of that stuff, because Steve Margetson, our lead developer for the game, has done an awful lot of that. As well as you, Sai, as well, and other people, bits and pieces going forward. So I kind of have just finished my sanity checks and been working through with Steve now on final design development sort of decision bits and pieces, kind of signing off characters and scenarios and bits and pieces. So early next week, we move over into full graphic design handover, which effectively means there will be some tweaking to numbers, I'm sure, still going on there. But realistically, what that means is now we're going to sit down with our graphic design team and then really start to bring these cards to life a bit more, sort of populate the templates with data, like, actually, and this is what I mentioned before, the small bits of paper that we printed off that, they were made in Microsoft PowerPoint or Excel or whatever, and now going to start to actually turn into actual cards. They're going to start to turn into actual things, assets we can look at and then go from there. So that's where we're at now. Yeah, it's exciting, really exciting. This is the part where you'd expect developers and designers can step back from the project, but if anything, it's actually more like we need to be on hand all the time to answer lots of barrage of questions about what does this thing you've written on here in black pen mean? What does this icon that I don't recognize mean? What's that supposed to be? Oh, you want me to make another icon, do you? Okay, you could have given me a heads up on that one. That sort of stuff. So it's interesting.
And yourself, Si, in terms of just day-to-day bits and pieces of what you can talk about, of course.
I've actually, in the last few weeks, I actually have stepped away from Resident Evil as it gets to that point. I'm sort of done with my development process. I've been moved on to the latest project that we announced this week for a totally different video game. But as someone on the outside who has seen it a little bit, it's going to be very exciting to be on the inside to see those graphical stuff come back. Most certainly, that's going to be a special day for all of us, as much as it is for people to actually sort of see it themselves when it finally comes out. Because having been in that position of just like, here's your PowerPoint of cards, it's rather drab. Your imagination has to fill in the blanks. So to see the final products can be very exciting indeed. But Resident Evil, unfortunately for me now, I'm sort of done with the project for the time being.
So we've spoken about Resident Evil 2, the board game, 3, the board game, 1, the board game. And I appreciate this is going to be a super early question, but is that Steamforged Games signing off on the trilogy, or do you think that there will be potential for more down the line? With regard to Resident Evil, of course.
Let's use the stock answer we always give. I think we would be mad not to consider that we could make another Resident Evil game in the future.
So you're telling me that Gaiden's on the cards? What you're saying?
Mate, I would make Gaiden. I would make Gaiden in a second, but I would not want to. I would not want to write that business case. I don't think I could get. I don't think even with the best will in the world I could get that through financial feasibility. Gaiden is probably that little bit too niche.
And when it comes to Gaiden, I think Sherwin has the best will in the world for it, because you played right into his heart there, certainly.
Yeah, well done. I would make a strong argument that that's Gaiden is one of the best games. It's amazing.
I got a soft spot for it, but I don't know if it would be the top of my list if we were given a choice.
Indeed.
Let's put it that way.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've spoken about Steamforged. We've spoken about the board game. We can start letting our hair down a little bit. Let's talk first aid spray, since I've both got you on. Run us through what first aid spray is, what you've been doing the last couple of years, and what you're working on currently.
So First Aid Spray is a podcast primarily, but I guess at this point we are kind of self-describing ourselves as sort of like a network of shows, primarily Resident Evil focused. That's the way it started, sort of tail end of 2018. And since then, we've really kind of spiraled from being a podcast to also doing YouTube editorials and lists and that kind of thing. We do bonus episodes about other games and media. We, in the last year, started a show where we rank music from the Resident Evil series as well. That's always a lot of fun. And we've got some, do you know what? We're announcing it tomorrow. So for those of you who are here early, we're going to be announcing 2 new shows to add on top of that this weekend as well. Primarily Resident Evil media, but in the last little while, we've really been kind of expanding what that is. And in a strange sort of way, First Aid Spray exists because of the board game community, because that first ever episode is myself, Sherwin, Steve and Jordan, and Steve is also someone that's a part of that community, and one of our other guys, Adam, is also part of that community. So a lot of us kind of met over the board game as well, which is just strange coincidence.
That's wholesome. Yeah.
It's absolutely wholesome. Our entire community is absolutely wholesome. That's for sure. It's just one of those things where it was a lot of stars aligning, where it was just like, do you know what, let's try it out. And now we are over 3 years into it, and no signs of slowing down, obviously, hence the 2 new shows. So it's very exciting. So much like you guys, it's all, Resident Evil content, whatever we can find to do, we want to do it.
And for yourself, Sherwin, how's the First Aid Spray experience going?
Do you know, it's a really weird one, because I always describe myself as, I I feel like I'm the biggest freeloader on the First Aid Spray podcast network. I bring none of the recording, editing, or charisma skills that any of the other hosts bring, but they seem to hold me in enough stead.
Yeah, but neither does Kim Kardashian. You know?
Yeah, I know, but I just haven't got. I haven't even got what Kim's got going on. You know, like it's something where it's something where they kind of let me kick around like a bad smell, which is very sweet of them. And I keep on finding one day I thoroughly expect Sai to have an awkward conversation with me where it's just literally, you know what, Sherwin, thanks for the memories, man, but game over. And at that point it's done. That's kind of what I expect. I think it's because generally my and this goes for my time at Steamforged as well, and I don't think it's necessarily well-founded, but I've been told it's not well-founded. But my thing is always that I always feel like I'm one of the least talented people in the room, so I make up for that with work ethic. I will literally work until my fingers are bloody to make sure that something I'm working on comes out the best it possibly can be. And if it takes me twice as long to get there, then so be it. I'll make sure I put in that time to make it happen. And with First Aid Spray, because I don't necessarily possess the skills to be able to do a lot of that stuff, I have to watch some really amazing people doing really amazing things around me, and I can't do that. I always feel slightly uncomfortable that I'm not doing enough. And but yeah, that said, I mean, I wouldn't get rid of that community at all. What for the world? I love the First Aid Spray guys, and I love the community built up around it. And I see a few familiar names here as well, which is cool. So yeah, it's amazing. I do think, and I wasn't aware of this. I see someone trolling KDB with the fact that apparently our best of music for RE3 was put an RE2 track at the top of it. We probably need to have words about that. I don't know if that's the thing that happened, that's shameful. But there we are.
Yeah, that's a thing that happened.
But
obviously I will have to disagree with what some of Sherwin says there about not bringing anything to the table. Certainly, of course, you know, every part of our team comes at it from a completely different perspective. What I think separates First Aid Spray from some of the other Resident Evil content creators is that there's a lot of guys out there that their entire team, they're super hardcore, super nerdy, and know all of the lore and everything. That's not necessarily true of all of our guys. It's just a different flurry of personalities. One of our panelists out of the 7 is pretty much brand new to the series and came in a couple of years ago. Remake 2, I think, you know, being the first new game they played. So it's always interesting to have like totally different perspectives from completely across the board in so many different ways. And Sherwin brings kind of, and since you said it earlier, the old man perspective of someone who just adores the classic games and has that kind of perspective on sort of their release and I guess the entire Resident Evil series from there outwards. And yeah, I just think we have a wonderful combination of different personalities and experiences.
Well, this is the beautiful thing about Resident Evil, because it spans such a long time. I mean, I would always count myself as an older fan. Like the original trilogies were the best for me, but you might get people that have only played 5 and 6 and Operation Raccoon. You might even have fans, and it's sorry to say, that have only watched the films. You know, there's such a diverse Resident Evil fan base that are all into different things. So when someone says, "Oh, define Resident Evil," that's like
Absolutely.
a multifaceted, nuanced answer that probably between all three of us will all give a different answer.
No, totally. That is something that we say on the show a lot, is that Resident Evil is just a lot of different things to a lot of different people at this point. So whilst we've been a podcast for over 3 years, there are a lot of elements that we haven't covered in the slightest because we just want to go the full gambit with it. We've done all the Anderson films. We're making our way through the books. Maybe we'll touch the comics one day. We certainly haven't touched half of the games released, just because why rush through that when there is just so much Resident Evil? Let's just pick and grab at whatever we want to go through and just really mix it up. So yeah, look out for our podcast on the stage show at some point later this year, perhaps. Who knows? Because that's a thing. As you say, Resident Evil has been so much over the years. There's no reason not to just look at it from all those different perspectives.
Well, I mean, even just saying that, I mean, as you say, think of since the start of First Aid Spray, how many things has Resident Evil? How many times has Resident Evil reinvented itself in that time?
Absolutely.
How many new games have there been? I'm told there are Resident Evil movies. I mean, that might be a thing that's happened. I mean, how many like how many things of movies or TV shows have been announced? How many different perspectives have we had? There's a whole bunch of different stuff.
Yeah,
and there's no sign of it slowing down either.
Absolutely.
With the series coming up, who knows what's in store for that?
Yeah, it's a crazy time for Resident Evil, and obviously for us at First Aid Spray and you guys at BHD, it's like a great time to be creating content around it, because there is just so much. There's always something new around the corner. It's like, maybe, so what if you didn't like this game or this film? In 6 months, probably there'll be something else, because as you say, it's just going on and on and on with new content. At some point, we might even get our reverse. Imagine that.
I won't wish too hard. So obviously the First Aid Spray, much like the T-virus, it's spreading.
Right.
What is the ultimate goal for the First Aid Spray podcast?
Would it be too ham-fisted a reference to say complete global saturation? Is that too obvious? Do you know, I don't know really. We never really have a goal. It was always just, let's try it and see if we had fun. I know this is a bit sort of maybe saccharine or whatever, but when we started the first episode, and it probably shows, it's probably true with a lot of like podcasts and stuff, but it really probably shows on episode 1 that was the first time a lot of us had actually spoken to each other really, sort of as part of a voice call. So for me, like, First Aid Spray has really just been about the relationships with these guys and with the community as well that have grown since then. We're all very close now, so that's wonderful. As long as we can keep that up and people are enjoying what we're doing, I'm happy with that. But I mean, other than that, if I want to put my sort of like cold stone heart back in, maybe the answer is just more social media followers, please.
I feel that's whilst those answers are kind of fun, they're also boring. So I'm going to reject them completely. I feel that the ultimate goal of a First Aid Spray at this stage should actually be for, all the hosts to meet each other to start with. Like, none of us even actually met up in person. That would be a good start. We could actually, go from there. Because I don't know how tall KDB is. I don't know, I don't know if these people still look like they do on their social media pictures. I don't know these things.
That's right.
I want to know these things. We need to. I literally want to go and hang out with you guys in some dingy arcade with an old beaten up House of the Dead machine and laugh at how crap it is. That's the thing that should really be happening. Yes, there needs to be, as I'm seeing in the comments, there absolutely should be First Aid Spray Con. That should be a thing. That's the new goal. We're gonna have a con where basically it's us bumbling around on just maybe like 24-hour panels, just waffling crap at each other.
That'd be great. We could have so many special guests as well.
Yeah, everyone is a special guest in that thing, because we'll run out of words pretty quickly, and then people will realize these guys are just rambling idiots. We'll go from there.
Aren't we all?
Exactly. All the best of us are.
That's right.
Of course.
So, and obviously the other answer is Gaiden remake, but
of course, yeah.
That's the old man goal.
Well, we know our good friend Aidan Watkins over at Classic Aria Mods is always working on bits and pieces. So I wouldn't be shocked if he drops one of those, drops a Gaiden remake soon. So let's actually talk Resident Evil. So if I start with you, Sherwin, what would you describe as your perfect Resident Evil and your favorite Resident Evil?
Oh God, this is a hard question, isn't it? Dino Crisis.
Hey.
No, so you're gonna not count that one. I'm not gonna go for the lols and say Gaiden. It's really, really, really hard to argue against RE remake. It's really, really, really hard to push back against that. There are elements that I think really encapsulate for me Resident Evil in a really, really awesome way, but they tend to be snapshots in certain parts of games versus a whole game experience. Like, for example, and this is a weird one, but I love the intro to let's clarify that. Not the intro to Gun Survivor. I like the first moment you get control of your character in Gun Survivor. I love the moments where you literally start off in a courtyard. It's silent. You can hear a dog howling in the
Yes.
distance, and you literally have the crunch of the gravel underneath your foot, and you're just literally walking forward, entering into this room, and it's just creepy and silent. That for me really encapsulates everything Resident Evil. It's awesome, and I know, of all things, I love the otherworldly surrealness of the Resident Evil 2 on the Gamescom of all things. There's something so grainy and so gritty and so perfectly low budget and kind of quite nightmarish. It just feels thoroughly detached, and you're kind of playing it going, this doesn't feel like normality, but I recognize there's buildings and I recognize kind of there's enemies and stuff. What is happening here? That somehow for me really connects in a really interesting way, and uses to create something. But if I'm looking at a whole holistic experience, it's tough. It's got to be between Resident Evil 2, the original, and remake. And it might be that I think Resident Evil has the remake has to just tip it. It does, but it's really close.
And yourself, Si?
Well, first of all, Dino Crisis 2 is the superior Dino Crisis game.
Oh, I'm so glad someone said it.
Let's get out of the
I'm
way.
so glad someone said it.
Sherwin leaving
and I'm
first
tired
aid
of-
spray announcement.
And I'm tired of pretending like it's not.
I mean, come on, 200 round shotguns. You really can't complain. I'm afraid I am going to give some.
Can't you complain?
I'm going to give some very boring answers, because my answers are pretty much exactly the same. If I had to say favorite, it without a doubt, no hesitation, it's Resident Evil 2, the original. And a lot of that is nostalgia. You know, it was the first game in the series that I played. It was my introduction to the series. It's eternal for me. Like, it took me at one point a few years ago, I was like, I'm actually going to figure out my ranking of my favorite video games of all time. And I went 1, Resident Evil 2, the rest I'll figure out later. Like, it always will be whatever. It is. I don't have the words for it. I'm so biased.
Yeah. No, but I'm exactly the same. I'm exactly the same. Resident Evil 2, 1998. It floors everything. It has this charm, which I cannot explain, and I can always go back to it. And it never gets old. It never gets boring.
Right.
There's just something there's something in the story.
There's a lot of... It's difficult to use the word timeless about a game that I would agree, if a lot of people picked up now hadn't played before, they would really struggle with the way that it plays and how dated it might be. But as you've just said, the story and elements like that clearly are, because all of those things transposed to the 2019 version, whilst I may not agree with some of the choices and and stuff like that, I mean, it did gangbusters for a reason. It's that location, those characters are just, if you make them sing, they're going to sing. Yeah. So for me, it's going to be Resident Evil 2. I don't think the original Resident Evil 2 is necessarily the best game in the series. I would agree it's probably the Resident Evil remake. It is just the purest form of what Resident Evil is and should be to me. But yeah, my personal favorite will always be Resident Evil 2. So when we finally cover that on the podcast one day, expect me to be that same babbling wreck that you just saw there for 5 seconds. Because it's just... I can't.
Of course. And it's interesting, actually, because, as hardcore Resident Evil fans that we are, seeing the leak of Resident Evil 1.5 and capturing it, and I know it's had various modifications, so it's not necessarily in its original unhindered format. Kind of seeing the glimpse of what Resident Evil 2 could have been in a previous life. I am very much happy they decided not to do that, because the concept of 1.5 is cool on paper, and it's more of the mystique, if anything. But actually seeing it and playing it through, fully as full as you can, you actually realise, wow, Resident Evil 2 absolutely shits all over this. I'm glad that they scrapped this.
Yeah, I'm actually going to quote Sherwin from when we covered it. He said something so poignant, I think, that was the existence of Resident Evil 1.5 is so awesome that people that don't know about it, you literally want to grab them by the arms and shake them and tell them how cool this is, this half-finished Resident Evil game that we, back in those days, were all vaguely aware of because of screenshots online and the video that came with one of the other games. I guess it was the DualShock version of Resident Evil 1, I think, where and then when the game came out, it was so different. It was like, this is so bizarre. It blows your mind. You're right. Like, they made the right choice to scrap it. But as a part of history, it's just incredible, isn't it, to look at and think of what could have been, for the worst. But it's an amazing sort of artifact of gaming.
I suppose it would be unfair to completely write it off, but just on the direction that they were going in it, the RPD to me it's almost like a supporting character of Resident Evil 2. And it has that character which carries through, as you said, into the remake. As kind of a core element of a core character of the game. What was your just on the basis of that show? What was your thoughts on Resident Evil 1.5, following on from Size?
I love the existence of Resident Evil 1.5. It's one of those strange fairy tale myths that couldn't possibly exist now in the gaming world. That just doesn't happen. It is absolutely something where that's just how things could be done back then in the day, and that is something where that could be that's just what could happen back in then, because just the way that games were made was different in terms of the commerciality of them, the way that studios worked and so on. It gives it this really hardcore element to it, and it's just so fascinating because the possibly the most exciting thing about it is just seeing this other vision of what Resident Evil could have been. Going where Police Chief Irons is actually this noble kind of officer who sort of said to the rest of his officers, "Get out, I'll look after this place while you can," and is dying on a couch from a zombie bite, kind of thing. Where this thing where Ada has actually got much more of her story of what she had from the original Resident Evil, where she's actually a researcher. Where you have Kendo is not Kendo that you know of. Kendo, some random guy you find in the cell. Like, loads of stuff like that is just it's utterly fascinating. And I mean, it's so hard not to get caught up in the hype about it and not to just go, this is so amazing. Like, I'd love to play this. I'd love to see this. And it's sad because, for all that I've kind of watched playthroughs of people playing the rebuilt version, I must admit, I do find myself going, I kind of like the mystique of this sort of barely glimpsed world, like almost a dream that you woke up from and you can't quite remember. You kind of just have these small snapshots that you kind of land with. And I think that's the stuff where you kind of just go, like, I think it's almost perfect as this mythical creature almost that you can talk about and you can remember. I think one of those things where getting to walk around it for a short while, kind of, I've jumped into this mod and actually I can walk around this thing, is cool, but it's not actually what the original was. It's kind of almost someone retelling a story and trying to pretend they were there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's almost like a Chinese whisper in a way, like what their interpretation of what it would be, which is and again, and this is no slight at the guys that are working, really hard to get this in get it in a near complete format, and real credit to them. But what was it? So they're working on the 45% build. We're told that there's an 80% build out there somewhere in the world because of some images from bioflames that no one's ever seen since. What do you guys think would happen if we found the coveted 80% build of 1.5?
I think people would talk about it on Twitter for a few weeks and then they'd probably move on to the next thing. I think it's possible, though. Stranger things have happened when you think about video gaming as a whole and sort of urban legend. I always think about the E.T. buried in the desert thing that turned out to be true. It's certainly possible that a disc is floating around there and it will turn up one day, much like what I hope possibly that some sort of ROM of the Resident Evil 0 on N64 turns up. Just
TGS release,
right, just like the 4 or 5 rooms or whatever that we've seen, just to be able to see that a bit more, just to walk through that. And again, wouldn't actually want that version complete or anything, but to have like almost like it materialized finally is like, I don't know, it puts an extra layer on it. But I don't know, it's an interesting concept, isn't it? There's a lot of things like that in the Resident Evil series where it's like, what ifs, 3.5 and stuff like that,
The one thing about Capcom is they love throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
So, yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
I think there's no, it's okay. There's an old saying which is satisfaction is the death of desire, and yes. I think that's very, very true for remake for why I wish for 1.5. I think if you were to see the whole of it in its entirety, I think, or the 80% build, that would be really, really cool. Would be amazing. Would feel just this incredible experience, I'm sure. But at the same time, then you'd stop, look at it as this thing on this plinth that we've all been staring at it that way. And I kind of like it being something where it is on this plinth and it is this unknown mystery. I think there's so much more romanticism about it that way.
Very well tactfully put. That's a really nice way of saying it.
See, not useless, is he?
You basically have me on a show for like, I don't know, about an hour and a half, and then eventually I'll come up one soundbite and then I can bugger off again. That's how it works. I told you, it's just persistence of workload. That's what it is. I just throw loads and loads of work at the thing until eventually something sticks, and then I'm good.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, football's a sport, and the only time in football in that whole 90 minutes is when someone scores. So, and you, my friend, just scored.
That's an interesting analogy. I like that.
Sure, that's a different.
You have to understand that Sherman is a Cleveland Browns supporter, so that's not how sport works. There's no scoring involved.
Yeah, there's no scoring whatsoever.
So yeah, Resident Evil, eh?
What? Every podcast, or every show, you know. Resident Evil, guys, it's great.
It's just it's crazy. Just the people it can bring together, the unique stories that kind of everyone has. This is literally why I do this BHD podcast, is because of all these unique stories. You know, we went from talking about the board game, which is obviously what you guys do for a career, and then talking about the hobby that is Resident Evil. And it's so unique that no matter where you are in the world, you all have your own story of Resident Evil, what it means to you.
Every time we have a guest on the podcast, it's almost like a running gag now, where it's like, that is the first question I will ask them is, how did you get into the series? And most recently, our guest, Mike Martin from Nerd Masons, who was on our coverage of the Underworld SD Perry book, said, you know, it's the same story as everyone else. I played it with a brother or whatever. Everyone's got the same story. And then he went off in this crazy direction about how his disc broke and he only played the mansion section over and over again. And I was like, no, that's what I'm looking for. Everyone has something like that where it's like, oh, my disc wasn't working, or somebody,
I didn't have a memory card.
Right.
Always, I did.
Yes, yeah. That's a great one. Somebody wrote something in the manual that stuck with me because it was a secondhand version of the game, or I actually played, the Gamecom version of Resident Evil 2 before the original. My first game was Gun Survivor 2. It can be anything. That's the beauty of a series with 25 years, and as we said earlier, so much variation in it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very well articulated point. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate you making time for me. I know we've been very prompt in getting this out. A few last words on the board game just before we wrap up here. Just another couple of quick fire facts about the latest Resident Evil board game that you want to let the fans know about.
Sure. I mean, if you've listened to us babble along and it sounds cool and it's really awesome, then please do go to our website now, which is steamforged.com. You'll be able to find the late pledge stuff, details on there. Late pledge, it's a great time to get involved in the game. I mean, obviously it's Resident Evil. It's the big daddy of them all, effectively, in terms of the games. But there's so much stuff now which is packed into that actual release and that pledge that it's definitely worthwhile to do so. And hopefully a lot of the people in the comments will back that up. That's not just me kind of making a sales pitch. But genuinely, the other thing is, please do head over to the Resident Evil Facebook group, or the Resident Evil board game Facebook group, I should say. There's an awful lot of really nice people in there who just love the hobby, I guarantee, just as much as you do, and will introduce you to a whole new world and a whole new facet of Resident Evil that you probably didn't know existed if you've never dipped your toes into the board game world.
And Sire, for the First Day Spray podcast, you want to give a couple, the floor is yours.
Sure. Yeah, please do come along if you're looking for more Resident Evil focused content to check out, whether that's podcast or YouTube stuff or whatever. We're trying a little bit of everything. You can pretty much find us anywhere at FA Spray Pod, but everything goes on our website at faspraypod.com. And as I say, we've got some new stuff coming. It's going to land next week. We're really very excited about. So now is a really good time to hit that subscribe button, I guess.
Brilliant. As I said, thank you guys for joining us on this edition of the Biohazard Declassified podcast. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in. Stay safe, look after yourselves, and hopefully we'll catch you all in the next episode. Take it
Thank
easy.
you. Bye.